The gentle morning breeze carried the sound of chirping birds as Mrs. Chen made her way down Pine Street, her faithful companion Rex trotting beside her. At 72, she kept an active lifestyle, taking daily walks with her German Shepherd, who had served honorably in Afghanistan before retiring from the U.S. Army's Canine unit 3 years ago. The neighborhood had always felt safe to her, with its well-maintained houses and friendly neighbors who'd wave as she passed by. Rex's calm demeanor and warm brown eyes made him a favorite among local children, who'd often asked to pet him. Few realized that beneath his gentle exterior lay years of specialized military training. That Thursday morning seemed like any other. Mrs. Chen wore her comfortable blue sweater and carried a small bag containing Rex's treats and water. The early autumn air felt crisp, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked their familiar route. 2 figures had been watching them from a beaten-up gray sedan parked near the corner. They'd noticed the elderly woman walking alone several times that week, apparently accompanied only by what they assumed was a regular pet dog. The taller one nudged his partner, pointing out her small handbag and the golden bracelet that caught the morning sun. "Look at that old lady," he whispered. "Easy target. The mutt won't be a problem." They couldn't have been more wrong. What they saw as a simple companion animal was actually a highly trained combat veteran with over 200 successful missions under his collar. Rex had been specifically trained in threat detection, suspect apprehension, and civilian protection. As Mrs. Chen and Rex approached the shadowy area near Henderson Park's entrance, the 2 men emerged from behind the thick oak trees. The shorter one moved to block their path while his partner circled behind them. Mrs. Chen clutched her bag tighter, her heart racing as she realized the danger. "Hand over the bag, lady," the first man demanded, pulling out a switchblade. "Nice and quiet, and nobody gets hurt." Rex's posture changed instantly. His ears perked forward, and his muscles tensed, a transformation Mrs. Chen had seen only once before during a training demonstration. The retired military dog's years of intensive training kicked in automatically, his protective instincts heightened by the clear threat to his handler. The world seemed to slow down as Rex assessed the situation, just as he'd been trained to do countless times before. His military instincts kicked in, reading the attacker's body language and identifying the immediate threat, the knife-wielding man who stood barely 6 feet away. The taller man behind Mrs. Chen laughed, reaching for her shoulder. "Looks like Grandma's got herself a pet guard dog. Better call him off before he gets hurt." Before he could finish his sentence, Rex exploded into action. His movements were precise and calculated, just as they had been during his military service. He launched himself toward the man with the knife, using a specialized disarming technique that targeted the wrist rather than the weapon itself. The attacker's eyes widened in shock as Rex's jaws clamped around his forearm, applying exactly enough pressure to cause him to drop the knife without causing serious injury. This wasn't the clumsy attack of a family pet. These were the refined moves of a combat-trained professional. Mrs. Chen remained surprisingly calm, her hand steady as she pressed the emergency alert button on her phone, another habit her son had insisted upon after Rex came to live with her. The second attacker, seeing his partner disarmed, tried to make a run for it. But Rex wasn't finished. After ensuring the first threat was neutralized, he shifted his attention to the fleeing man. In 3 powerful bounds, he caught up to the runner. Instead of attacking, Rex circled in front of him, using his body to block the escape path. Another military tactic designed to contain rather than harm. "Stay down," Mrs. Chen called out with unexpected authority in her voice. During Rex's placement with her, she blended the basic commands used in his service days. The would-be robber, faced with a clearly professional military dog, chose to follow her instruction. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Park from next door, a retired police officer, quickly grasped the situation and rushed to help. He kept his eye on the first attacker while Rex continued to guard the second one. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as red and blue lights reflected off the morning dew on the grass. Rex maintained his professional demeanor, showing no aggression but allowing no movement from either suspect. His training had taught him to use minimal force necessary while protecting civilians. A young mother watching from her porch with her children couldn't help but smile at the irony. Just yesterday, she'd seen Rex gently playing with neighborhood kids, accepting belly rubs and sharing his tennis ball. Now she was witnessing the same dog effortlessly switch into his former military role, demonstrating years of sophisticated training. The police cars pulled up to the scene, officers emerging with hands on their holsters, unsure what to expect. Their tension visibly eased when they saw Rex's professional stance and Mrs. Chen's composed demeanor. One of the officers recognized the distinctive way Rex held his position, a telltale sign of military canine training. "Ma'am, is that a retired MWD?" asked the first officer, using the abbreviation for military working dog. His face lit up with understanding as Mrs. Chen nodded. The officer had worked with similar dogs during his time in the service. As the police began securing the scene, Rex maintained his watchful position until receiving a subtle hand signal from Mrs. Chen. He immediately returned to her side, his mission accomplished. The transformation was remarkable, from fierce protector back to gentle companion in an instant. The officers discovered that the two attackers were part of a game targeting elderly residents across 3 counties. Their car, parked around the corner, contained stolen items from previous robberies. What they had mistaken for an easy target had turned into the break the police department needed to solve a string of local crimes. The shorter attacker, still nursing his wrist where Rex had grabbed him, couldn't stop shaking his head. "We thought it was just some old lady with her pet," he muttered as an officer helped him into the patrol car. "Nobody told us she had a military-grade protection dog." News of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Children who regularly played with Rex watched in amazement as police photographers documented the scene. Their friendly 4-legged neighbor, who usually spent afternoons catching tennis balls and begging for belly rubs, was suddenly revealed to be a highly trained military hero. The local coffee shop owner brought Mrs. Chen a hot cup of tea as she gave her statement to the police. She sat calmly, one hand resting on Rex's head as he lay at her feet, once again the picture of a peaceful companion. The owner couldn't help but notice how Rex's eyes still scanned the area periodically, maintaining his protective watch even while appearing completely relaxed. "You know," Mrs. Chen told the attending officer, "when my son suggested I adopt a retired military dog, I was hesitant. I thought I needed a simple pet, not a trained service animal. But Rex adapted so perfectly to civilian life. He knows exactly when to be a loving companion and when to be a protector." In the days following the incident, Mrs. Chen's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news stations wanted to tell their story, fascinated by the unexpected twist of a retired military dog living quietly in their community. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just Rex's heroic actions, it was the beautiful bond between an elderly woman and her extraordinary companion. The police department's Canine unit requested a visit, hoping to document Rex's training techniques. They were impressed by how seamlessly he had switched between his protective and social roles. The unit's trainer watched in amazement as Rex demonstrated perfect recall, responding to Mrs. Chen's commands as if they'd worked together for decades. "The bond is everything," Mrs. Chen explained to a young canine officer. "Rex doesn't just protect me because of his training. We've built trust. He knows I depend on him, and he chooses to watch over me." As if understanding her words, Rex gently placed his paw on her knee, making the officer smile. The story caught the attention of veterans groups, particularly those involved in rehabilitating and rehoming military working dogs. They invited Mrs. Chen to speak at their next meeting, seeing her experience as a perfect example of how these highly trained animals could adapt to civilian life while maintaining their protective instincts. During their regular morning walks, neighbors now saw Rex in a different light. Parents would point him out to their children, explaining how the same dog who played fetch in the park was also a trained hero. Young kids would ask Mrs. Chen if they could still pet him, and Rex would wag his tail happily, showing no signs of his fierce protective side. The local elementary school invited them for a special presentation about service animals. Rex demonstrated basic commands while Mrs. Chen explained how military dogs could transition into loving family companions. The children were fascinated by how Rex could switch from playful to alert with a single command, then back to gentle when given the signal. The most amazing thing, Mrs. Chen told the wide-eyed students, is that Rex knows exactly who needs protection and who's a friend. That's not just training, that's intelligence and heart. She watched proudly as Rex allowed the children to pet him, his tail wagging while his eyes still periodically scanned the room, ever the vigilant protector. The incident inspired the local police department to start a community safety program, with Mrs. Chen and Rex as their star example. They organized a workshop teaching senior citizens about personal safety, and Rex played a crucial role in demonstrating protective techniques. What happened that morning wasn't just about having a trained dog, the police chief explained to the gathered crowd. It was about building the right partnerships in our community. He pointed out how Mrs. Chen's quick thinking with her emergency alert, combined with Rex's training and the neighbor's response, created a perfect example of community safety in action. During these workshops, Rex would demonstrate the difference between normal dog behavior and his specialized training. The police canine trainers would explain how his military background gave him unique skills, but it was his bond with Mrs. Chen that made him truly effective as a protector. A veteran support group reached out to discuss starting a program matching retired military dogs with elderly residents who lived alone. They saw how successful Rex's placement had been and wanted to create more such partnerships. Mrs. Chen began advising them on the special considerations needed for these unique arrangements. One afternoon, while Mrs. Chen sat in her garden with Rex, a neighbor's child asked her if she was ever scared during the attack. She smiled, patting Rex's head. "You know, I wasn't scared at all. When you have someone you trust completely by your side, fear doesn't stand a chance." The local paper ran a feature story about their partnership, focusing not on the dramatic incident but on their daily life together. They described how Rex would bring Mrs. Chen her slippers in the morning, how he knew to walk slower on days when her arthritis bothered her, and how he would rest his head on her lap during afternoon tea. This caught the attention of a military dog training facility, who invited Mrs. Chen and Rex to speak to their trainers about the importance of considering a dog's post-service life. Rex's ability to maintain his training while adapting to civilian life became a model for their program. As autumn turned to winter, Mrs. Chen and Rex's story continued to inspire changes in their community. The local animal shelter started a special program for senior pet adoption, emphasizing how older animals could make perfect companions for elderly residents. They often pointed to Rex as an example of how age and experience could be valuable assets in a companion animal. The police department's follow-up investigation revealed something unexpected. One of the attackers, during his interview, explained how they had targeted several neighborhoods, but always avoided homes with large dogs. "But this lady," he told the detective, "we thought she just had a regular pet. Never knew there were super dogs living among us like that." This comment sparked an interesting discussion at the next community safety meeting. The police chief explained how having trained dogs in the neighborhood actually helped prevent crime, even when they weren't actively stopping criminals. "It's not about having an aggressive guard dog," he clarified. "It's about having well-trained companions who understand the difference between a real threat and a friendly visitor." During the winter months, Rex showed another side of his training. When snow made the sidewalks slippery, he automatically adjusted his walking style to provide better support for Mrs. Chen. If she needed to steady herself, he would stand perfectly still, using his training to become a stable support. These small moments of everyday care touched the neighbors even more than his heroic actions had. The local coffee shop, where Mrs. Chen often stopped during their morning walks, put up a small sign, "Military Dogs Welcome." They even kept a special water bowl for Rex, and the owner would often tell new customers about their neighborhood's gentle guardian. Rex would lie quietly under Mrs. Chen's table, accepting occasional pets from regulars while maintaining his subtle watchfulness. A documentary filmmaker visiting the area became fascinated by their story, not for its dramatic elements, but for what it said about second chances and unexpected partnerships. She spent several days filming their daily routines, Rex helping Mrs. Chen collect her morning newspaper, their walks in the park, and their quiet afternoons in the garden. "What strikes me most," the filmmaker noted, "is how this highly trained military dog has found such happiness in these simple, peaceful moments." The camera caught Rex gently taking his favorite toy from his basket and bringing it to Mrs. Chen, his tail wagging as she threw it for him in their backyard. As spring flowers began blooming again, Mrs. Chen received a special invitation from the U.S. Army's Canine training facility. They wanted her and Rex to attend their graduation ceremony from new military dog handlers. The trainers believed their story perfectly illustrated how military working dogs could successfully transition into civilian life while maintaining their valuable skills. At the ceremony, young handlers gathered around Rex, amazed by his calm demeanor. Mrs. Chen shared stories about their daily life, explaining how Rex's military training actually made him a better companion. "He doesn't just protect me from danger," she told them, "he protects me from loneliness too. Every day, he finds new ways to show he cares." The local elementary school where they had given their presentation started a new tradition. They created an annual Hero Pets Day, where children could bring their pets to school and learn about different ways animals help people. Rex became the event's unofficial mascot, demonstrating how the same dog could be both a fierce protector and a gentle friend. Then morning walks became something of a neighborhood institution. Parents would time their school runs to cross paths with them, teaching their children about respect for elderly neighbors and their pets. Rex would always pause to accept gentle pats from the kids, showing perfect patience even with the most enthusiastic young admirers. The police department's community safety program expanded to neighboring towns, using Mrs. Chen and Rex's story to show how partnerships between humans and animals could strengthen entire communities. They emphasized that true safety came not from fear or force, but from understanding and trust. 1 year after the incident, the neighborhood organized a special celebration, not to remember the attack, but to celebrate the positive changes that had grown from it. The local park, where everything had happened, was filled with families, dogs, and even some other retired service animals who had found homes in the area. During the celebration, Mrs. Chen sat on her favorite park bench, Rex at her feet as always. She watched children playing, neighbors chatting, and several other elderly residents with their newly adopted companion dogs. The police chief had been right. Their story wasn't just about an attack prevented, it was about a community transformed. "You know," Mrs. Chen told a group of neighbors as Rex gently accepted treats from them, "people often ask me if I feel lucky that Rex was with me that day. But I think the real luck was having him in my life every day." The incident just showed others what I already knew, that sometimes the best heroes are the ones who spend most of their time just being loving companions. As the sun set on the celebration, Mrs. Chen and Rex walked home together, just as they did every evening. Rex maintained his usual alert but gentle demeanor, a living example of how being ready for anything doesn't mean you can't enjoy every peaceful moment along the way.